Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. Thank you for joining us once again as we walk across the great battlefields of Europe. Now, you may have noticed the schedule has been a little bit disrupted in the last couple of weeks, so apologies for that. It's due entirely to the return of touring. It's a good problem to have, but the fact that Pete Smith is now out leading tours across the battlefields, and I'm here in Australia urgently trying to organise tours for people to get over to the battlefields in 2022, it's meant we've been a little bit disrupted with the podcast. But I promise we're about to get back on track. Thank you for sticking with us through this difficult time. We're about to get back on track with the podcast, and we've got lots of great things coming up. And this week, we're not out and about. It's another one of our special episodes, formerly only available to subscribers, but we're going to present it now to everyone. And this week, following on from our chat about machine guns that we did last week, this week we're going to talk about something a little bit unusual, food. We're going to talk about food during the First World War. What did the soldiers eat? Where did it come from? How were they kept supplied? It's a fundamental part of running any army is to keep them well fed. It's always been the issue with getting large groups of people out in the battlefield is how do you keep them fed, and that hasn't changed over the centuries. It's still an issue today. In the First World War, it was a very big issue, and they had some novel ways of dealing with it. So this episode deals all specifically with logistics related to food and keeping the troops fed. It's part of the story of the First World War that's not often explored, and so Pete and I are very happy to sit down and have a chat about this. So I hope you enjoy it, and we look forward to joining you next week as we walk back across the battlefields of Europe. Hello and welcome to the next of our bonus episodes for subscribers only. Thank you very much for joining us as a subscriber. Great to have you on board with this bonus content. Pete and I enjoy the chance to sit back and have a chat about a few things that we don't get to talk about in the main podcast. So thank you for joining us in this endeavour. Pete, welcome back to the bonus episodes.
Great to be on a bonus episode. I can relax. I've got no notes. I can make things up as I go along.
It's very laid back, isn't it? I do feel the same. We record our main episode and now we get the chance to just sit back and just have a bit of a chat. There is a very relaxed feeling about it. I really quite like it. So thank you, dear listener, for joining us because it's quite a different experience to the main podcast. The machine guns we did last week was well received, Pete. That was a good episode and I enjoyed doing it. I don't realise until we get stuck into these specific topics how many interesting things there are to talk about.
Well, I think the problem we've got, isn't it, is that once you start talking, you forget that these are supposed to be kind of a bit snappy and a bit quick, and we're off, and an hour later we're thinking, hang on a minute, we're still talking. So, yeah.
I think this one is the one that's particularly in danger of that, but we'll do our best to not have it go on too long. We're going to talk about food and provisions, and, an army marches on its stomach, and it's something we overlook. My friend Reece Crawley here in Australia is, does a lot of work on the First World War, and he's a big man in logistics, particularly at Gallipoli. And he always says that he puts the sexy back into logistics, which certainly sums things up. That it's something that gets overlooked, logistics and feeding an army, but it's obviously essential to keeping men alive and fighting.
It is indeed. So what were they eating and how did it get to them? And there's a load of other things. So the subjects, I was kind of quickly thinking what we're going to be talking about. What was the official food? How did it get to them? What else did they get behind the lines? And did they get food from home? And the answer to all of those is yes, they got all of the above. So where are we going to start? So I think, should we start with what was their official food in the front line? What would they have been eating in the front line?
Well, one thing I wanted to just mention here before we kick off is historically before the First World War, or before the wars of, the more modern wars that the First World War would definitely count as, the way that they used to feed armies is they used to have livestock as well. Behind the armies, traditionally as armies marched into battle, they would have livestock and shepherds and people to look after the animals.
Well, women.
And they would... Yep. Yeah, they would go into battle with livestock, and then they'd slaughter the animals and feed them. So that worked fine when the battlefield was relatively small, and when arrows were the only things being flung around. But obviously that wasn't going to work when they started firing up artillery pieces and devastated the entire landscape. So Pete, how did they do it?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is obviously the invention of tins and glass jars. I mean, those are going to be crucial. So what are they going to be putting in the tins? Well, the soldiers' nightmare food, I suppose, was bully beef, renowned for, which is effectively corned beef, renowned for being in the summer you poured it out of the tin, and in the winter you hacked it out of the tin. So the weather depended upon what it was like. And so that would literally, you would open a tin. We get them now. One of those tins with a little key on the side that you twist and you go around the top. And normally it snaps off halfway around, and then you're trying to get the top off with a knife and liable to cut your finger off. Well, no change in the First World War. They had all of those problems. And what's fascinating, we still find them. We still find the remnants of those tins in the battlefield. So bully beef, that'd be one of the foods. The second one was jam, again in a tin. So, but this one didn't have a self-opener. You had to kind of get a tin opener in there and open it. And there always used to be a soldier's joke. It was always plum and apple. And they used to say, when is it going to be strawberry or raspberry or anything other than plum and apple? And of course, it's always going to be plum and apple because they're cheap and you could grow them almost anywhere. So plum and apple jam was one of the other foodstuffs. And then I'm going
to just jump in briefly to talk about jam because it's one of my favourite anecdotes. And I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but Peter Hart talks all the time about Gallipoli, about what it was a veteran that told him this that actually said this to him, and it's stuck with him ever since. So in the heat of, because we should remember the First World War wasn't just the Western Front, also some of the harsh environments of Gallipoli and elsewhere, and a soldier told Pete during one of his oral history interviews that the saying on Gallipoli in the heat of summer was that a fly's two favourite foods were shit and jam, and they'd fly from one to the other. And it's just used as an example of how illness spreads so readily on the battlefields that when there's so much human waste lying around, and then you're trying to eat a meal of jam, as soon as you open a jam tin, flies are just going to swarm on it. And some of the famous of all the bastards of a place, this is the greatest bastard of them all, came about because of an Australian soldier trying to describe how to eat jam on a biscuit without it getting covered in flies. So jam, the soldiers' connection to jam was far-reaching during the war, and never necessarily a good one.
No, indeed not. Hardtop biscuits, they really seriously weren't joking when they said they were hard. These biscuits were just kind of almost square, really, really kind of bulletproof biscuits. And in fact, they were so hard, and this became a chargeable offence, but soldiers would stick a stamp on one corner, write an address on the biscuit, and post it to their relatives as like a postcard, the biscuits. And it became a chargeable offence because it was bringing the army into disrepute by doing that. And I've actually had one in my collection with a stamp on the corner of it.
The biscuits we're talking about here look much like in Australia we have a biscuit called a sayo. So basically, imagine a thick sayo. Imagine a sayo about a centimetre thick. That's sort of with the little holes in it. That's sort of what they look like. But demonstrating their durability in the Imperial War Museum in London is in their Gallipoli, their very small Gallipoli display. They have from an Australian soldier his name and details carved into an army biscuit. Yeah, which is still sitting there over a century later, perfectly preserved. So they were tough. How did they eat them, Pete? Like, how did they deal with
tea?
Biscuit?
They tried with tea, basically, to soften them with tea. And I suppose if you could actually smash one and get a piece into your mouth over a period of time with the moisture, it would eventually break down. But they were fairly kind of hideous things to put in your mouth. And I found a fantastic account in an Australian battalion's war diary where they were asking for all the men to hand in their hardtack biscuits. And the quartermaster had found a local mill with a crushing mill who would take the biscuits. He would crush the biscuits and he would return it as a flour. And then the men could put it into their stews, or they could do lots of other things with it. But it made it more usable than actually the biscuit itself. And I thought that was very interesting that they would do that. So the hardtop biscuits. I have to say, there's a lot of these things that we will talk about that I remember from my time. They hadn't kind of gone a great deal further forward. The biscuits weren't quite as hard as that, and some of them had raisins in them as well. But we also had a very hard biscuit that was fairly bulletproof, I have to say.
The other thing that we've seen that have turned up from time to time, I've seen in museums, is like an improvised grater that they used to get a sheet of metal and bash holes in it with a nail. And then on the rough side, obviously where the nail had come through, that would be like a bit of like a cheese grater. And then they would use that to grate up the biscuits as best they could to make a powder. And then they could make some sort of porridge, mix a bit of jam in there or a bit of stew and turn it into some sort of porridge. But, just extraordinary. And interesting as well, you say that it carried on through the decades. Speaking to some World War II veterans who'd fought in Guadalcanal with the Americans when the Marines first arrived in August 1942 on Guadalcanal, because they'd been sent at short notice. They were issued with 1918 rations So they this is how long this stuff lasted.
Yep.
Their rations that they were given to land on the beaches in 1942 had been issued in 1918 during the Great War.
Well, I remember
They're obviously hardy stuff.
It's no different. I remember opening up chocolate bars and finding the date on the chocolate bars, and this would be in the early 80s, and these chocolate bars were from the 60s. And this tasted all right, but I suppose I wasn't that fussed, really. You're not that worried. But yeah, some of this food was designed to last a long, long while.
Is that why the biscuits were so hard? Simply for that reason?
Yeah, I think so. Made them very, very durable. Yeah, very durable.
I suppose they're less likely to go mouldy if there's no moisture in them.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of this food, you can imagine it's fairly bland as well. And also depressing if you're eating the same thing day in, day out. And so the soldiers would try and enhance things themselves. And so you often get, and we did exactly the same, I have to say, in my period, we did the same. We took curry powder, take a little twist of curry powder in either a little plastic bag or in a foil, OXO cubes, that kind of thing. Well, during the war, of course, the men requested from home, can you send me out some HP sauce or some kind of sauce so that I can add that to my bully beef, and it kind of livens it up a bit and makes it feel a little bit more homely, I suppose, and more tasty. So all over the battlefields, again, we find fragments of bottles or complete bottles for the variety of sauces, including HP sauce, which of course is still made today, still comes in a square glass bottle, as it did during the Great War.
Pete, I'm going to ask you to tell me about bottles in a minute with a sense of trepidation. But just before we do that, before I forget my connection with bottles on the Western Front, is that in 2007 I made the documentary Lost in Flanders, where we excavated an Australian trench system. And one of the things that I dug up with some very talented archaeologists, I didn't contribute much to the dig, but they gave me the opportunity to jump in the trench every now and again and dig some stuff up. But I found an Eno's bottle, Eno's salts for indigestion, which I thought was extraordinary. So that had obviously been sent in a care package from home. I wouldn't have thought that indigestion was too much of an issue for soldiers at the front line. But there was an interesting connection about that, because I saw an interview with Peter Weir, the film director, talking about what inspired him to make the movie Gallipoli in 1981. And he said that in the 70s he went to Gallipoli, and as he was walking the ground, he uncovered a whole heap of relics that were still there. And one of the things he found was an Eno salts bottle that he'd found that had obviously been sent in a care package. Yep. And that very bottle they then used in the movie. There's a scene where Mel Gibson is opening a care package from home and sort of scoffing at the stuff that he'd been sent, including Eno salts, an Eno salts bottle. And that was the bottle that Peter Weir had found at Gallipoli, then he used in the film. And that was what inspired him, because he just said the story of this bottle came from Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, had been sent to Gallipoli. A soldier has opened this in a care package, used it, and then discarded it. And then nearly a century later, I uncovered it. And that was part of what inspired him to make the movie Gallipoli. And then fast forward another 30 years, and there I dug up an Eno salts bottle on the Western Front. So have you come across those before? Things like medications and... Well,
as you know, just recently I was given a rather large collection of bottles, of glass bottles of all different types, from a chap is leaving the Somme, and the house that he lived in had been a contractor that had lived there previously, who had a digger, and when he'd been digging all over the battlefields, he'd come across bottles, and he just kept on throwing them into containers. And so anyway, they've just been given to me, and I'm having great fun at the moment going through cleaning them and sorting them, and it's a combination of, you have to say, of Eno salts and the like, of alcohol. And this is, and in this collection there are both German and French and British. And for British, I mean all of the Empire forces, the Commonwealth forces. And it's a mix. It's a mix of sauces from all over the world to enhance the food, alcohol from all over the place to help you survive on the Western Front, full stop, and then a variety of remedies to cure a variety of stomach conditions caused by that, either A, the food, or B, the unsanitary conditions that you're living in. So absolutely fascinating, and I'm cataloguing all of these, and I may put some pictures up later on one of the sites associated with our podcasts. But yeah, really good fun and fascinating.
So, Pete, in terms of... the question I was going to ask you about this is, we hear about hardtack biscuits and jam and bully beef. How often was a soldier relying on that as a meal?
Yeah, not too often. It really is when he's in the front line for that period, whether it be 3 days, 24 hours. During an attack, he would be expected to carry iron rations, which iron rations are basically hardtop biscuits, and he may, if you can get a bar of chocolate from home, he may stick that in. But it's really that frontline period. Behind the lines, everybody, no matter what you are, whether you're in an engineering battalion or company or you're an infantryman, there are field cookers. So you have to say, what are the field cookers doing? Well, they're creating, you would have to say, stews. They are creating stews from stuff that is supplied to them, so great lumps of ham or beef, and then sometimes locally bought vegetables, but also they will be supplied. And so that's what they're doing, that they're creating stews. While I'm thinking about it, I just need to go off on a slight tangent. Most battalions set up their own canteens. So in other words, there was a place that behind the lines a soldier could go to his battalion canteen and could enhance the things himself by spending some of his money in the canteen, and it was subsidised. So their own canteens, there was some of the money normally taken out of their pay to go into the canteen, and then the canteen would subsidise whatever they could eat. So there was a range, but it was all, even the stews, you just have to say, these guys, the cooks, are always maligned, something terrible, that they were never cooks. They never ever picked anybody that could actually cook. They would pick somebody who was probably a blacksmith and gave him a spoon and a ladle and said, you can be the battalion cook. And there was always lots and lots of complaints about the quality of the food coming from the field cookers. But you have to say, the saving grace of this, it was warm, occasionally hot. I suppose warm would be the best for most of the time, but at least it was food that was warm, and that helped immeasurably. And the same applies for tea, for hot drinks. In the front line, very difficult to get you a hot drink behind the lines, and that was really what the field cookers were for. They would try and get them as near as they could in an area of safety, so that men coming in or into the line or coming out of the line could have a hot feed at either occasion, knowing that it would be difficult while they were in the line. So they tried very hard, and the whole system was very, very well organised, and did for the most part run very well.
Our dear friend Peter Hart, and I recommend go and listen to Peter Hart's Military History, Pete and Gary's Military History podcast, to hear some fascinating stories, because Pete spent his life talking to veterans, and so I get many of my veteran stories secondhand from him. But another one that he told me, it just reminded me that I think it was in his series about the South Notts Hussars. They did a whole series about a Second World War artillery unit. I think it was that one, but one of the veterans he spoke to was actually a chef in his previous life. He'd been working as quite a renowned chef. And when he enlisted, they said, go down this branch, because otherwise you just end up in the infantry. If you go down this branch, you'll be able to contribute by, your cooking skills will be much required in the army. And so he enlisted and went down this road. The first day in the kitchen, the only supplies that he was delivered were turnips and raw rabbits. That was what and he had to feed an entire company with turnips and rabbits. So you can just imagine the sort of high-class colour, the haute cuisine he would come up with with those supplies. How often did the men, Peter, back to the First World War, that was a Second World War story, but back to the First World War, how often did the men, how often could they get meat? How often could they get fresh fruit and vegetables?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about the fruit, but certainly vegetables are meat, so long as they're behind the lines. They would try and get it to them all the time. I mean, it is mind-boggling when you think of the millions of men, literally the millions of men that needed to be fed on a daily basis. It really took some organisation, but it was organised, and it's one of the things I hear and you read occasionally when people say, the men were starving. Well, actually, they don't mean it literally. What they mean is, and I've mentioned this previously, I think, in the podcast, is it's just like my lad when he was growing up, and when he was doing lots of exercise, he was always starving. In fact, he seemed to be starving for most of his teenage years. Well, that's what he'd say, Dad, I'm starving. Well, so did the men. They said, I'm starving, and they wrote home, I'm starving most of the time. And of course, people tend to take it too literal. It doesn't mean that they're literally starving. It means there's not enough food to keep growing, fit, healthy men who are being asked to do very, very manual tasks. They needed really more calories, and that's what they really mean. Nobody literally on the Western Front starved to death. There was never that lack of food. What there was just just mundane, having the same thing over and over again. One of the interesting things that you read is when they captured German lines, when they captured the German trench, when they overran a field kitchen, they always got stuck into the German food. There was never any worry about whether it had been poisoned or not. I don't think it even crossed their mind. They just ate whatever they found. And the German food was as mundane as ours. The difference was it is different, and that was the key. They actually ate different food. So the black bread and the sausages that they would get as they went to the German rations were so different to their own that it was something new and great.
Well, it's fascinating you mentioned that, because the Germans on their side, they did start to run out of food as the blockade occurred, and the famous stories we heard, which I believe are true, is that they started, the increased amount of sawdust that used to be mixed in with the bread, and the common comment from German prisoners as they were captured, when they put their hands up, say, "Kamerad, Kamerad," "Nicht schießen, don't shoot." But the other thing, as they were taken into custody, they would say is Fleisch, meat. The Germans were desperate for the bully beef. They hated bully beef that the Brits and the Aussies couldn't wait to get rid of. The Germans were desperate for, because they just couldn't get any meat in their side of the line as the blockade started to bite. So you're quite right that the variety was. It probably goes back to the thing where the soldier says they're starving as well. Probably what they're starving for is their mum's cakes and jams and scones that she used to make them. They're probably desperately missing home.
Well, there's an interesting comment, actually. I'm just going to go back quickly before I forget. Field kitchens. What exactly is a field cooker or a field kitchen? Well, it is an aga, the old great big metal stoves that some of you may have used at some stage in the past or be aware of. Imagine an aga on wheels. That is what the field kitchens were. So they could be brought up to the front and would march with the troops. So they were very handy. Right, back to the food from home. Well, that's one of the issues. Is the postal system was so good for those soldiers who had relatives in Britain that they could literally send fresh cakes and certainly fresh food and enhance the soldiers' diets immeasurably by sending these things to them. And very often, one of the comments that you come across quite often is when old Jim's being killed and next day his cake arrives from his mother, and they have no qualms in sharing it out among them because they know that that's what he would have want them to do. So food from home was very common. Obviously, for Australians from around the empire, that's not quite as easy because it's so far. But there was basically a drive in Britain to adopt a soldier from the colonies almost, and so you could adopt a soldier and be the surrogate family for them, and so they would still receive some fresh food as well. So and you're looking at 2 or 3 days for parcels to arrive on the Western Front from Britain. So the system was excellent.
There's a really moving account that has been told about at Pozières, the capture of the Gibraltar blockhouse. So it was a German blockhouse that the Australians captured, and one of the first Aussies who went into this blockhouse, which is still there, I should mention, the cellar, the rough foundations are still there at Pozières, but one of the first Australians in there found a couple of things. There were no Germans in there anymore, but he found, firstly, there was a German greatcoat, with a hole right through the back of it where a shrapnel ball had come in, and it was soaked in blood, so obviously a German had been wounded and probably died in the blockhouse in agony after having been wounded. But also he said he found little cake boxes with little cakes in them and a little note on them in a child's handwriting. And so obviously a child had baked some cakes and sent them to their father in the front line. And the Australian made the connection and assumed that the man who died of his wounds, obviously quite horrifically, in that blockhouse was the man who had these little cakes from the children. He said, and the quote that he finishes up just was something along the lines of, some would say the man was a German, so not entitled to much sympathy, but I couldn't help thinking of the little boy or girl who sent the cakes. Just the small little touches of humanity, yeah, absolutely, even for your enemy. Yeah,
very, very moving. So parcels did come from home. I just want to squash a myth, really, or quash a myth, which is interesting and sad in some ways. Anzac Biscuits, which obviously we look at and think about because they're robust. So we imagine that, yes, if an Australian wanted to send something all that way from Australia, well, an Anzac Biscuit would be a suitable thing to send. But in fact, I don't think anybody's been able to find the recipe for an Anzac biscuit until after the war, or close to the end of the war. So I don't think Anzac biscuits are quite as common on the Western Front as we imagined that perhaps they were. But I'm sure there were other biscuits that were very similar.
The story I've heard about Anzac Biscuits, what I tell, and I could have this wrong, but this is what I believe from what I've read, and it gets a bit confused, is that people hear the word biscuits, particularly when it relates to Gallipoli. They hear the word biscuits and they get confused with Anzac Biscuits. From what I've seen, Anzac Biscuits were baked in Australia as fundraisers and to represent, at fetes and at stalls and as fundraisers, they would bake Anzac Biscuits, and the recipe came about because they couldn't get sugar, and so they substituted golden syrup, and because things were in demand, in short supply, they did their best, and that's how they came up with Anzac Biscuits. But it was not actually intended to send to soldiers in the front lines. That was never the intention. So I think people get a little bit confused with the idea of an Anzac Biscuit, and that also the soldiers talk about eating biscuits when they refer to their hardtack biscuits, and it gets a little bit confused. But I don't believe the intention was to send Anzac Biscuits to the soldiers. It was for fundraisers and things back home.
Which is a shame, because they're damn nice.
They are very, very good. Australian ingenuity of using whatever you've got lying. Well, isn't that the thing? The war, whatever they've got lying around, they throw together and make an Anzac biscuit. And any of our international listeners who don't know what we're talking about, seek them out. They're delicious.
They are,
with the oats and golden.
Simple to make, but very nice.
And every year when we do Anzac Day, Pete, at Hamel on the Western Front, and we have breakfast with the people of Hamel, that they've gotten into a tradition now of baking Anzac biscuits for the Aussies, which is really lovely to see. Last time I was there, the little kids gave me a little packet of Anzac Biscuits on Anzac Day.
I fill my pockets. I know it's going to be a long day, so I fill my pockets.
And they are quite delicious. But so what we like to do in these things is also talk about the experience for the men. So I know we've touched on that a lot, but what were the thoughts of the men about the food they were supplied during their time in the First World War?
Well, they were. I mean, they were horrified about the amount of I suppose bully beef that they ate, and this jam issue, and to such an extent, you can go into shops and have a look, as I do quite often, and look at the old postcards, First World War postcards. I'm a collector of them. Go and have a flick through the comic ones. And it's a reoccurring theme that you'll see over and over again about the food and the quality of the food. But soldiers moan about the food, full stop. Having said that, I have to say that in my day, the food that we actually got from the military, and it's changed considerably nowadays, but we had chefs and people that would cook us food, and I always thought the food was very good, and I didn't ever have any problems with it. But I think if you were anywhere near the front line, then it became very mundane. The other thing I should add, when you mentioned about the meat and getting the meat to the front, they did actually, as they had in the past, but this time there was no movement. In the old days, the cows and the pigs came along with you on campaign, being dragged along, looked after by camp followers and the wives that came with you. But behind the lines, up near the coast, they set up farms. And so they had farms and they had piggeries. And certainly they were breeding the food and raising the food for the men on the front line here in France. So it didn't have to be shipped in from elsewhere.
It's interesting, Pete, you talk about the quality of the food. There was a recent thing. I've got lots of friends in the military here in Australia, in the modern military. And there was a recent argument that was going on because anyone who knows someone who's in the modern military, I mean, your son, I'm sure Matt is the same. They are supremely fit. They spend all of their downtime in the gym they're the fittest people you would ever find. And there's been a real push in the Australian military to get higher quality food because these people, they're living on protein shakes and vegetables and kale and all the stuff that, young people these days enjoy when they get back from a gym session. And so there's been a real push in the Australian military to get more fruits and vegetables and less processed food. Because they're all basically gym junkies. They're gym junkies who carry weapons, and they insist on having the diet to match. And I think that's fair enough as well. They're at peak physical condition, and so we've got to make sure we support them with the right nutrients.
It's amazing when you're in heavy training how many calories you need. And in my day, there wasn't that ability to get all of these supplements, and I'm not sure that we'd have been allowed to at that time anyway. But things like I remember diving down to the NAFI, and this was common for all of us, and grabbing a pint of yogurt and drinking that pint of yogurt straight from the pot as you were trying to get back. And this is thick yogurt. I'm not talking about the modern drinking yogurt. This was thick yogurt, and trying to drink it as you were walking or running back to your accommodation to then change into your next uniform for whatever it was doing, you just could not get enough calories inside you and we were all losing weight all the time. And so, yeah, I think we're back to that story again of the men were starving in the front line because they couldn't do that. So they were, and we haven't mentioned this, what were they getting behind the lines from the civilian population? Well, you have to say the staple thing that they were getting were egg and chips. Because any farmer's wife behind the lines worth their salt had chickens in the yard, and for the eggs and potatoes in storage. So it meant that any time of the year, a soldier behind the lines, not just from a cafe, he could knock on a farmer's door and say, "Have you got any?" Well, in French, of course. Have you got any in pidgin French? Have you got any oofs? And they would knock up egg and chips for them. So it was very common, and I have to say, quite partial to egg and chips myself. So I'd be going along with that.
And Pete, what about today? You must come across in your walks across the battlefields and your collecting and the things that you found. You must find examples of food and what they were consuming. What sort of things do you come across on the battlefields today? Yeah,
well, it's the remnants of tins, the remnants of glass containers. So one of the things we haven't mentioned, pickles. So pickled things, they came out here in large numbers. So it's those containers really that you find. Of course, what you do find are bones of animals that have been butchered, but there's no guarantee that they aren't from the civilian population before or after the First World War. But those are the things that you tend to come across when you're looking at. And further behind the lines, we do come across the signs for the old cafes. A lot of them have closed now, but you do realise that at one point almost every village had 2 or 3 cafes in it, and you have to say that is from that period when there were so many people behind the lines that anybody who had any kind of business head on would try and open a cafe or something that would feed all of these men wandering about looking for food and other needs that they needed.
The famous estaminays of the rear areas. The one thing we haven't mentioned.
Yep.
Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say estaminay, fascinating. It's a term that's almost completely gone. We don't see. The only time you'll see the name estaminay is historic on the wall of where one used to be. It's a term that's almost totally gone.
One thing we didn't discuss, which you also find an awful lot of, probably the most common thing you find, is remnants of rum jars. It's not really food, but it's part of the rations. Talk us about rum and the rum jars. Yeah, well, rum
was supposedly, I'm sure they didn't get it all the time, but in the morning you had a splash of rum with your tea. It was called gunfire. Odd having, we kind of associate rum going into coffee, but it was in your tea. And so rum came up in stoneware jars, big gallon, in fact, 2-gallon or half-gallon jars, emblazoned with the initials SRD, which we now know stands for Stores Reserve Depot. So it was about the jar, not about the contents, but it was always rum inside. But the soldiers knew it as seldom reaches destination on the outside of the jars. And we find lots of those. We find that because they were also utilised after the rum had gone for water. You literally find them everywhere. So it gives you an idea of how much rum came up on a daily basis to warm the cockles of the men in the front line.
And the jars would break. Obviously, they stoneware, so they were prone to breakage. But it was the first thing I ever found on a battlefield. It was outside Prowse Point Cemetery. I was walking just across a field there. My first ever visit. Only been on the battlefields for a few hours, and desperate to see something from the war, to just find something tangible from the war. And I looked down, and there at my feet was a shard of rum jar, and I picked it up, and it actually said SRD on the other side.
Yeah,
so that
brilliant.
was the first relic I ever found on a battlefield.
I think I remember you picking one up at Gallipoli some years ago, bending down and picking a lump of rum jar up on the foreshore, one of the foreshores at Gallipoli as well. It's common there as well.
I found a few at Gallipoli. They turn up quite commonly there as well. So no, that's always a good thing to find. It's and something that people can take home, and especially if you get the corner that's got either a bit of the glazing on it from the sort of the darker brown on the top is good, or occasionally the lettering SRD. You occasionally do get if you're lucky enough to find a shard that's got SRD, or even just a D or a fraction of a letter on it. It's a great find. So something that people can take home from the battlefields. They're not, these are not precious relics that should be in museums. These are the humdrummery of daily life. So a perfect souvenir for someone to take back from the battlefields. And there's millions and millions of them all over the battlefields.
Yeah, there sure are.
Pete, it's been wonderful. Thank you. A really interesting insight. And I mean, we could talk for many more hours on this topic, but I hope it's given a good overview of some of the facets to do with feeding and logistics on the battlefield. There's so many fascinating topics like this that we'll explore as we go on. But thank you, Pete, for joining us on this, and thank you for listening in on our bonus subscription episode.
No, it's been fantastic. Looking forward to the next one.